Please join me in welcoming Chris Stedman, our 2013 Martin Luther King Day lecture guest.
Thank you all so much for coming out tonight, and I want to extend a special thank you to everyone who was involved in organizing this project. If we could give them all a round of applause, please. That would be great. And also, thank you for your heartfelt words in the introduction. I almost feel like I don't need to speak now, but I guess I probably have to. I guess I can't say enough what an honor and a privilege it is to be here to speak for the annual Martin Luther King Jr. lecture. Martin Luther King Jr. is somebody who I have long looked up to. Today he is known most widely as one of the key leaders of the U.S. Civil Rights Movement and for his tireless work for equality. He is, in fact, a very multifaceted figure. His deeply held belief that all people are created in God's image inspired Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to struggle nonviolently for social justice around the world, not just in the United States. His heartfelt conviction that God called on all people to confront social injustice of all kinds encouraged King to reach out to all communities of people in creating what he called a beloved community of shared values, mutual understanding, and positive social action. But when people think of him, they think of him as a civil rights leader. What fewer people think of is the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as not just a Christian leader or a leader for civil rights, but an interfaith leader. He was inspired by the work of Gandhi to reach across lines of faith and to practice nonviolence. And he partnered with the Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, an Eastern European Jewish man who barely escaped Hitler's death camps. In America, Heschel joined the civil rights movement, claiming, quote, "The soul of the Jewish people is at stake in this movement." As the old rabbi and the young black minister marched together in the name of equality, Heschel remarked, quote, "I felt as though my legs were praying." King built lines not just across religious differences, but also across continents and language barriers, collaborating with and inspiring many other leaders, including Thich Nhat Hanh, showing that the beloved community could be truly a global vision. King's vision was connected to his deep Christian commitment, a commitment that insisted that he work with others from different religions in order to make that vision a reality. He began this radical work before he was even 20 years old. He was truly an innovative interfaith leader. In 1968, Dr. King wrote, "We have inherited a large house, a great world house, in which we have to live together. Black and white, Easterner and Westerner, Gentile and Jew, Catholic and Protestant, Muslim and Hindu, a family unduly separated in ideas, culture, and interest, who, because we can never again live apart, must learn somehow to live with each other in peace." This vision of building a world house across lines of religious and cultural differences is what inspires me in the work I do today as an atheist and an interfaith activist. But unlike King, my belief in the importance of justice and dignity for all people isn't connected to an idea that we are all created in God's image, because I don't believe in God. I believe that with no divine or supernatural forces to intervene and save us, it is up to us as humans with the potential and the capacity to think and dream in new ways, to draw on our conviction and our courage, like King did, to work together to better the conditions of life for all people. But though I am an atheist, I have been inspired by my share of religious individuals, including Christian ministers, much like the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He's one, and his story is widely known and widely cited as a source of inspiration. And I'm sure everyone in this room has at one point or another heard someone talk about the influence that the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. has had on them. So I'm going to talk about a different Christian minister who has had an impact on me. You see, I wasn't always an atheist. When I was younger, I was a Christian. And when I was in high school, I decided that I was going to go pick my own pastor. I found a church where there was a pastor who was very young, so much so that everyone called him Pastor Doogie. Do people get that reference? Or, okay, just making sure. I have to admit, I didn't get it at first. He was gracious, eloquent, and kind, with a biting sense of humor that showed that he didn't take anything too seriously besides the love of God. After meeting and working with him at a church retreat, I loved his energy and his passion so much that I decided I was going to become a member of his church. For my first official act as a member of his church, I participated in something called a 30-hour famine. Is anyone familiar with those projects? It's a day where people will raise money for hunger relief and then will fast for 30 hours. And part of what I found so inspiring about the event was not only was I doing something to help other people, but I was actually participating in something that helped me understand the experience of hunger. It really drove it home for me in a way that simply talking about it was not able to do. And it really solidified my commitment to wanting to help improve the conditions of life for other people. But I actually want to rewind just a little bit further. I was raised in a secular household in Minnesota. You might hear it in my voice a little bit. And I converted to a fundamentalist, non-denominational form of Christianity when I was 11 years old. There were, I think, two primary things that preceded my conversion. The first was about a year prior, when I was 10. I started reading books like Roots, Hiroshima, The Diary of Anne Frank, pretty heavy material for a 10-year-old. It all started because I went to the library and got the biggest book I could find, which was the unabridged version of Roots. And I took it home to show my mom what a big book I was reading. And fast forward a few hours later, and I was sobbing on my bed. And these books really had a significant impact on me. Not only because they increased my awareness of some of the great atrocities that have occurred throughout human history, but they told the story of what it was like to experience those things. They humanized the experience of suffering for me in a way that, as a 10-year-old, I couldn't wrap my mind around. It raised all kinds of questions about justice and meaning and purpose, and so I was filled with all these questions and didn't know how to process them. And then the second thing that preceded my conversion was when I was 11 years old, my parents separated. And I had grown up in a very tight-knit household. We didn't go to church on Sundays. We stayed home and listened to records and cooked and cleaned. And when my parents separated, my mother re-entered the workforce and started working 3 jobs, and my family dynamic changed overnight. And I was looking for some stability. I was looking for community. And some friends invited me to go to this youth group that met after school. They told me there would be free pizza there, and so I was like instantly on board. And I went and I was struck by how welcoming the community was right away. They were very interested in me. They wanted to know what was going on in my life. And I also was very taken with the way that they talked about ethics. They talked about justice. And so for me, it was kind of, it seemed like it was going to be a great fit for about 2 months. And then I realized something that I had always sort of known, but had struggled to put my finger on, which is that I am a gay man. And the community that I converted into was very sort of theologically conservative and very explicit about their perspectives on matters of sexuality. And so I really struggled with my sort of sexual orientation and the relationship between that and my Christian beliefs. And a few years later, when I was sort of at my lowest of lows, my mother found a journal that I was keeping where I was detailing the struggle I was going through and sort of sorting through things. It was kind of like a prayer journal. And she found it because she's a Snoop. And are there any Snoopy moms in the audience tonight? A few? Yeah. Well, in this case, it paid off, so I can't be too mad. Excuse me. So she found the journal and called up churches in the community and found found a pastor for me to speak to the next day, who offered me a different view on sexuality and Christianity. And that sort of ushered in a period of my being very involved in progressive Christianity. I was very involved in progressive Christian communities throughout high school, and that was where I crossed paths with Pastor Doogie. And he became not only a pastor to me, but also a mentor and a friend. We prayed together, he helped me with college applications, he consoled me when my first boyfriend and I broke up. But most importantly, he came to symbolize a dedication to serving God by serving others that I hoped to emulate someday. When I was accepted to a Lutheran college, I told him that I wanted to major in religion and eventually become a pastor like him. I thought that these negative experiences I had had within Christianity, those years of believing that there was something wrong with me, were a way of God sort of helping me understand the experience of suffering, much like when I read books like Roots and Hiroshima, but for me to understand it in a personal way. I came to see those struggles as preparation for pastoral work in solidarity with the marginalized and the disenfranchised. I wanted to help others, like pastors like Matthew or Pastor Doogie had helped me. And the people I knew at that point in my life who helped others the most were pastors. What I didn't fully understand at that point in my life was that my desire to help others and be in community existed apart from the theological claims of Christianity, which had never really sat as comfortably with me. I had grown up non-religious, I had grown up not believing in God, and when I became a Christian, I kind of took on those beliefs as a part of a package deal. To me, it was if you wanted to be a part of this community and you cared about helping other people, well, then you believed in God too. But when I went to college to study religion, my Christian religion professors encouraged me to take a critical look at my initial conversion experience, to ask myself difficult questions about what I believed and why, and they wanted me to be able to articulate where my beliefs came from. And as I began that process of self-reflection and critical analysis of my own beliefs, I came to recognize that while I valued the community and I valued the sort of highest principles of Christianity, the beliefs were never really something that had connected with me. And so I left the church and decided that I was an atheist. At first, being an atheist meant rejecting religion and all kind of interpersonal discussions about it. I was happy to talk about it in the classroom, but when it came to the religious friends that I had, I just didn't want to talk about it with them. But eventually, I came to recognize that I was missing out on a lot of opportunities to be in more, to have deeper relationships with the people in my life. For example, every week I volunteered at a community center just down the street from my college. I participated in a program where we took food from the campus dining center and we brought it and distributed it to community centers in the neighborhood. And this community center I went to every week was primarily frequented by recent immigrants from Somalia, the majority of whom were Muslim. And I came to be very involved in this community center. I started coming by even when I wasn't bringing food by, and really developed some significant relationships with the people there. But whenever conversations regarding religion came up, I would always quickly change the subject. As an example, one day I was speaking with a woman and she started talking about how sometimes when she was out in public wearing her head covering, people would shout things at her. And this was an opportunity, this was a moment where I normally would have changed the subject, but I wasn't thinking about what I was doing, and I said, well, you know, I can actually kind of relate to that in some ways, because sometimes when I'm out in public holding my boyfriend's hand, I get nervous because people will shout things at us, and we've had people, yell at us and throw things at us and whatever. And, I kind of connect with what you're saying. And I hadn't actually told anyone at this community center about my being gay. And I really didn't know what the reaction was going to be. But without missing a beat, she said to me, so what do you do in that moment when you feel afraid? Where do you find strength? For me, it is my belief in Allah and that Allah is protecting me, that's my source of strength. But I don't know anything about what you believe, and so I'm curious, what is it for you? And she totally was opening the door for us to have a frank and honest conversation about our beliefs and to enrich our relationship, to come to understand one another better. And I had studied Islam in the classroom, but I actually didn't have any relationships with anyone who was Muslim in a way that actually engaged that part of their identity. And it was a real opportunity for us to get to know one another better, but I realized what was happening and I quickly changed the subject. And later, after I graduated from college, I began to reflect on experiences like that and realized that I had been missing out on these opportunities. And so I decided I wanted to go back and take another look at religion and learn more about religious differences and the ways in which people who belong to different religious communities communicate with one another. And so I got a master's degree in religion, and I worked for an organization called Interfaith Youth Core, which works with college and university age students of different faith backgrounds to bring them together for interfaith dialogue opportunities and civic engagement programs, community service type programs. And as an atheist doing that work, I became very interested in the ways in which atheists and believers talk to one another and the ways in which they often don't talk to one another. And so I decided to accept a position at the Humanist Community at Harvard, where I now coordinate the first ever atheist-led interfaith community service program called Values in Action. And it was through this work of organizing these interfaith and community service programs that specifically include and highlight non-religious participation that I had the opportunity to rebuild one of those bridges. One day out of the blue, I got a call from someone who I hadn't heard from in years. It was Pastor Doogie. He called to let me know that he was in Massachusetts, which is where I live now, and asked if I wanted to get together and get coffee. As we sat down and caught up, he informed me that he had recently left a call in parish ministry and was now in Massachusetts working for an organization called Outreach Incorporated, which organizes mealpacking events for churches and conferences that want to give back. And in addition to coordinating these events, he donates his free Sunday mornings to traveling around New England and preaching at churches, hoping to inspire communities to get involved in the fight against hunger. I asked if he would be interested in expanding his partnerships beyond churches and Christian conferences and working with an atheist organization on an interfaith program, and he didn't even hesitate. It's funny because when he first asked me to get coffee, I did hesitate. I thought to myself, what will he think of the work that I do now? Will he feel like he failed me as a pastor? Will he want to argue and debate about theology? Will he try to bring me back into the church? But such hesitance was unmerited. He sat and listened as I updated him on my life, smiling and nodding as I described how I've come into my own as an atheist and an interfaith activist. And now Matthew and I have a better and more honest relationship than we ever did in my youth. It's been a more productive one, too. In the last year, we've mobilized hundreds upon hundreds of people to come together in interfaith coalitions to donate their time and money to package over 70,000 meals for food insecure children in Massachusetts. Currently, the food insecurity gap in Massachusetts among children is 180,000. So while 70,000 isn't all the way there, it's putting a pretty significant dent in hunger among children in Massachusetts. We also held an event called Hunger Rally, where we brought together over 100 student representatives from 8 Boston area colleges and universities to spend a Saturday night learning about the problem of hunger and pledging to work on their campuses and their communities across lines of religious differences to address it. These programs and others are all the direct result of a partnership between an atheist and his former pastor. And in light of this, I cannot help but wonder what the world would look like if we were more willing to forge unconventional alliances. What would happen if we were more radical about whom we saw as our collaborators? What would happen if we took the risk of reaching out to the unfamiliar, to the foreign, to those who make us perhaps a little uncomfortable? If atheists and Christians and all other people started seeing one another as necessary partners in making the world a better place, what might we come to better understand about one another in the process? What might we come to better understand about ourselves? And what might we accomplish together? Many of the most significant issues that afflict our world today, disease, economic disparity, access to clean water, systemic hunger, these are issues that don't discern our religious differences. They don't parse people into camps before they ravage. They don't care about our designations of us and them, religious and secular, the right ones and the wrong ones. And in fighting these issues, neither should we. Our work opposing these common enemies can also transform us into allies in the fight against bigotry and fundamentalism. They can show us that the divisions between those who are like me and those who are not are less significant than our shared humanity, our shared concerns, and our shared values. More than 1 billion people on this planet don't have enough food, including 1 in 6 Americans. So it will take more than just Christians or more than just atheists to solve this problem. My work with Matthew or Pastor Doogie and other interfaith and hunger activists in Boston is putting a very small dent in hunger, but it is a start. And for that reason, I'm so glad that I took Matthew up on his invitation to catch up. As we wrapped up our conversation, he asked me if I remembered how I told him that I had a call to ministry. I laughed and nearly spit out my coffee. I said, well, okay, I work for an atheist organization now, so I think it's safe to say that I was wrong about that one. He laughed, and his eyes darted mischievously from the Bible he had on the table to his former parishioner, and he said, you know, I was going to say that I think it's really nice to see that you've realized your call. I never did become a pastor, but by working with one, I've been able to do the work of helping others all the same. I call it service, he calls it ministry. Though our words are different, our values and our work are the same. And because we don't let those different words get in the way, we've been able to make that little dent in hunger just a little bit bigger. It felt good to pick my own pastor when I was younger, but it feels even better to pick the fight against hunger over the religious and secular culture war. That culture war can feel fun for some people. I think some people treat it like a sport almost. And I think that that kind of conversation between religious people and non-religious people is currently the norm. You know, when people hear about religion or they hear the word atheism, they often think of conflict. We live in a society where the media privileges conflict, and so the stories we hear about religion and about atheism are ones of arguments and disagreements and conflicts. I have engaged that way in the past, and I have regretted it, because little good came out of those kinds of engagements. But I've never regretted it responding to differences with love. As Martin Luther King Jr. wrote, the ultimate weakness of violence is that it is a descending spiral, begetting the very thing it seeks to destroy. Instead of diminishing evil, it multiplies it. Through violence, you murder the hater, but you do not murder hate. Returning violence for violence multiplies violence, adding deeper darkness to a night already devoid of stars. Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. Martin Luther King Jr. was only 26 years old when he partnered with people of all beliefs and backgrounds to organize the Montgomery bus boycott. As a 20-something myself, I am sure that King entertained the question many times, who am I? But when I think of how he lived, a larger question looms for me, and I think it's relevant for people no matter what religious or non-religious background you are, and that is, who can we be together? When I think of King and I think of interfaith and atheist activism, I think of King's close friend, A. Philip Randolph. He was a tremendously active union organizer and labor rights activist, and he later became a highly visible spokesperson for African American civil rights. In World War II, he organized a march to protest racial discrimination in war industries and segregation in the armed forces, and he was successful on both issues. He continued working for civil rights, and he was one of the primary organizers of the famous March on Washington, where Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his I Have a Dream speech. He was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1964 for this work, and he was an atheist. He was one of Martin Luther King Jr.'s closest friends and allies, and he was an atheist. So I think upon reflecting on King's legacy and his activism as an interfaith activist and as a Christian reverend, I think of the stories that King told and the way in which he was able to communicate stories that transformed the way that people saw differences and the way that they approached diversity. And so when we ask this question of who am I and who can we be together, I think the best way to begin bridging those differences and coming to better understand ourselves in the process is by sharing our stories with one another. Alasdair MacIntyre once said, "I can only answer the question, what am I to do, if I can answer the prior question, of what story or stories do I find myself a part?" This is why I wrote my book Faitheist as a memoir. This is why I've shared some stories with you tonight, because I see stories as a radical tool for humanizing diversity, for introducing people to new ideas, and for showing that, in fact, that our common human experiences are larger than the differences that we sometimes have. So, in closing, I want to share one last story. I hope that's all right. When I was a student doing my master's in religion, I took a preaching class, kind of just for fun. I think part of me wanted to see like what would have been. The other part of me was very curious about preaching as a sort of form of communication. And I learned in that class about the power of using stories to communicate ideas. But I also learned that according to my professor, you always have to end with a story. And I'm not very good at that, so I'm just going to just put it right out there right now that I'm doing this specifically for that reason. So when I was preparing to leave Chicago to move out to Massachusetts for my current job, I made sure that I went out of my way to meet up with people who had had a significant impact on me while I was living in Chicago. And so I tried to get together with friends that I had known over the 3 years I had been there. And there was one friend in particular that it was very important to me that I meet up with. Dramatic pause. This friend was someone I had met in one of my religion classes. I was actually joking earlier with someone in the audience about this, about how when you're from Minnesota and you meet another Minnesotan outside of Minnesota, you are instantly best friends because for whatever reason, Minnesotans are just really excited about being from Minnesota. And he and I were in a class together and we realized on the first day, I think one of us heard it in the other person's accent, that we were from Minnesota. And so we instantly became very good friends. And we also quickly realized we lived in the same neighborhood. And we had a lot to discuss. But one thing that we often talked about was the fact that he had never known someone who was openly atheist and openly gay before. He had never known anyone who was either of those things. And he was very interested in learning more, but also, you know, had a lot of questions and just didn't know very much. And so we would talk about those things. And we would always go to this little dive gay bar in my neighborhood, and it was always his idea to go there. I feel like he wanted to like do it as a symbolic gesture, like we were meeting on my territory. But I was like, this gay bar is not my territory. But I humored it because I saw it as a gesture of goodwill. And so we would always meet at this place, and we actually came to really love the place because there were some really interesting people watching there, and we always met people with incredible life stories. And sure enough, on our last time hanging out before I moved away, we were talking about why I was moving and what he was doing next, and I noticed out of the corner of my eye that someone was like very obviously eavesdropping on what we were talking about. And sure enough, about 10 minutes later, this man approached us and said, "Hey, I was eavesdropping on you guys." And I was like, "Yeah, I noticed." And he said, "I'm very interested in this idea of interfaith work, but I heard you say that you were an atheist, and I don't really get how that would work, why you as an atheist would be involved in these interfaith efforts." And so we ended up having an extensive conversation about it, and then we ended up talking about a lot of different things. But at one point, he asked me this question that really sort of got me. I just was kind of taken aback. I wasn't sure how to respond. And it's funny now because it seems like one of those obvious questions, but he said, and I want to read it to make sure I get it exactly right. He said, "Okay, but tell me this, Mr. Atheist." He called me Mr. Atheist, which I was like wondering if I was going to get a sash or like if there was a plaque that was going to come with that. Alas, it came with nothing. But he said, "Okay, but tell me this, Mr. Atheist. Where did we come from? How did all of this get here?" And I took a moment to sort of pause, and I realized I was suddenly way in over my head. I had some ideas. I'd done some reading about the origins of the universe, but really wasn't going to be able to give him a succinct and satisfactory response. But I actually realized I did have a response for him, and so I said, okay, well, I'm not a scientist, which is my way of, like, if I feel like I'm talking about something that I don't know that much about, it's my way of kind of opening a back door for myself. Okay, well, I'm not a scientist, but to be honest, that question actually doesn't interest me all that much. You know, I think that the study of the origins of the universe is very important. It can tell us a lot about our world, and it can be, you know, it's a very important exploration. But for me, personally, I'm not especially interested in how we got here. What concerns me the most is, given that we are here, what will we do? About a year later, a famed theoretical physicist named Stephen Hawking made headlines when he said during an interview that he didn't believe in an afterlife. But in my mind, the most pivotal moment of that interview was also the most overlooked. He offered an imperative call to action near the very end of the interview. He was asked, "So here we are, what should we do?" And he said, "We should seek the greatest value of our action." So given that we are here, what will we do? What is the greatest value of our action? I'm not a scientist, but I believe that the beginning of finding the answer to that question is as simple as seeking to understand the diverse people who are here with us and working together to advance equality and justice for all, just like the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. did. Despite areas of disagreement, significant as they are, we must find ways to build understanding across lines of religious differences and work together to improve the world. We may not agree on the existence of God or an afterlife, but we can agree that life in the here and now requires that we find a way to live and work together. I think the beginning of this is sharing those stories with one another, and I want to thank you for letting me share some of my stories with you tonight. Stories humanize diversity. A sociologist named Marshall Gans writes that stories are what enable us to communicate our values to one another. There's a psychologist by the name of Dan P. McAdams who elaborates on this idea, saying that story guides behavior in every moment, and it frames not only how we see the past, but how we see ourselves in the future. So the last question I want to leave with you tonight is, what future will we imagine for ourselves and for the world? Is it a world where religion is nothing more than a problem to be eradicated, or where atheists are nothing more than heathens or godless people? Is it a world where religion will continue to be seen as a bomb of destruction or a barrier of division, as my friend Ibu Patel likes to say? Or can we find a way to take religious differences and make them a bridge of cooperation? I think we can, if we begin to listen and tell more stories about our differences and then act together on the shared values that they communicate. Thank you very much.